It was just a photo, the kind you frame on the mantle, send in Christmas cards, tuck in drawers. But this one had a crease, right through my face. They said there wasn't enough space on the porch bench, that I could take it next year. So I stood behind the photographer, pretending I had stepped away for fresh air. They smiled. I disappeared. Funny how silence can be louder than any word. And just like that, I knew my place in the family was now behind the lens, not in front of it. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Comment below. My house used to smell like cinnamon, not just during the holidays, but always. A soft warmth lingered in the rugs, the curtains, the old wood paneling that creaked under familiar feet. I'd lived there 52 years, raised 3 children, buried a husband, watched the mailbox rust one stubborn corner at a time. The porch swing still held the faded cushion he'd made from an old flannel shirt. He never was good with tools, but his hands could fix most things, especially my heart. Frank died in that house, quietly, without fuss, just the way he'd lived. After that, the silence deepened. At first it felt like an ache. Then it became a rhythm. I had my morning tea at 6:30 sharp, read the newspaper, the real kind, and filled in the crossword in pen. I kept the living room dusted, the guest towels folded, and always had a fresh pie cooling on the sill, even if no one came by. It wasn't for them, really. It was for memory, for the echo of footsteps that used to run down those stairs calling, "Mama." It was 5 years ago when Mark came back, my middle child. Always the sharp one, always a little tired of me, though he never said it out loud. He'd just been through a divorce and said he needed a place to regroup. I said yes. Of course I did. A mother's heart rarely says no, even when it should. At first, it was nice having company. He mowed the lawn, fixed the leak under the sink, brought me takeout on Fridays. I crocheted him a new scarf that winter, gray and navy, his favorite colors. But then things began shifting, small things. His things, jackets, shoes, briefcases, started covering the couch. My knitting basket disappeared. My chair, the one by the window, got moved to make more space. He had calls at all hours, loud ones. Business, I think. I stopped asking. Then came Sharon, his new friend, followed by her teenage twins, loud as spring thunder, always plugged into some glowing screen. One day they just stayed. No moving trucks, no introductions, just a trail of plastic cups and noise. They took the guest room, then the sewing room. I was told the attic was too dusty for children, so I started keeping to my bedroom, third door on the right, the one with the soft yellow wallpaper and a cross stitched above the bed. Love never fails. They called me sweet, but always in that way people talk about wallpaper or chipped plates. The twins didn't know my name. Sharon called me her. I cooked less. They didn't like old people food. On Sundays, I still wore my pearls. I'd sit at the dining table, napkin folded on my lap, hoping someone might say grace. But grace had become something on their plates, not from their hearts. Mark said, "You don't have to wait on us, Ma." But I wasn't waiting on them. I was waiting with them. There's a difference. When I first bought that house with Frank, I remember painting the front door red. "It's supposed to mean welcome," I told him. He kissed my forehead and said, "Then we'd better keep it that way." But the door hadn't been red in years. Mark had it repainted a dull gray, said it was more modern. I nodded. What else could I say? I tried not to mind the noise, or the smells I didn't recognize, or the way my quiet corners were slowly filled with gadgets and wires and voices I didn't understand. I told myself this was family. Family meant bending, stretching, giving space. But no one gave space back. I remember once asking Sharon if she'd like help in the kitchen. She blinked like I'd spoken a different language. "We're just ordering in," she said, tossing a frozen pizza in the microwave. The twins never said thank you. They said, whatever. The pie I made last Thanksgiving, apple with hand-cut lattice, sat untouched. Mark said Sharon was gluten-free now. I still went to church twice a week, That little wooden chapel down on Jefferson Street. People there still saw me, still said my name, still asked about my knees, my roses, my life. I'd sit in the third pew, feel the music rise through my bones, and pretend I wasn't forgotten. Because that's what it felt like most days. Not hated, just erased. A quiet ghost in her own house. Even the neighbors stopped waving. Maybe they thought I'd moved or died. I wasn't sure. But I stayed. Not because I was weak, but because I kept hoping. That one morning, Mark would bring me coffee and say, "I'm sorry, Ma. I didn't mean to push you aside." That one night, Sharon might knock gently and ask if I wanted to watch a movie like old friends do. That one Sunday, the twins might sit at the table and say, "Grandma, tell us a story." They never did. Instead, I became the walls, the background, the extra chair they didn't need, until that photo, that one simple photo, a moment that should have held all of us, 3 generations, arms draped, faces lit, became a frame that chose to forget me. I stood on the porch, holding the cranberry dish I'd used for 42 years, and watched them laugh without me. And I realized I wasn't really in the family anymore. Not in their eyes, not in their hearts, just in name. And even that, I felt slipping away. It didn't happen all at once. That's the cruel thing about being erased. It comes in whispers, in glances, in things not said. Like the thermostat. I used to keep it at 72. My bones ached otherwise. But one day, it was set to 68. I turned it back up. The next morning, back to 68. I left a note on the fridge. "Please don't change the heat. I get cold." That evening, the note was gone. Not moved, not answered, just gone. Or the teacups. I had a cabinet full of china, soft rose patterns, gold edges, wedding gifts mostly. I always used the same one. Light blue, tiny chip on the handle, still held heat like a hug. One morning, it vanished, replaced by a tall black mug that said "Boss Mode." I asked Mark where my cup had gone. He shrugged. Probably got tossed out. It was cracked. Tossed out. Like it had no history. No hands that had held it in sorrow and joy. No mornings where Frank had filled it, whistling softly, just to make me smile. Then there were the appointments. I used to go to the senior clinic every other Tuesday. They knew me there. Knew my blood pressure, my stories, my favorite nurse. One day, the car wasn't available. Mark said he had meetings. The next week, Sharon said gas was too expensive. The week after, no one said anything. I sat on the porch in my sweater, purse in my lap, waiting. No one came. I started missing checkups, quietly. I wrote the dates in pencil, then slowly stopped writing them at all. I became small things, the person they spoke about when I wasn't in the room. She likes it quiet. She naps a lot. She probably doesn't even notice. But I did notice. I noticed when my birthday came and went. No candle, no card. Sharon had posted a photo of the twins at the mall that day, smiling in new jackets. I was home, folding towels. I noticed when my slippers disappeared, replaced by ones 2 sizes too big. "Got them on sale," she said. "Didn't know your size." I noticed when my old framed photos were boxed up. To declutter. All those faces from decades past. My mother's wedding portrait. My youngest in her cap and gown. My own smile, holding Frank's arm tight. Packed away like winter sweaters. Even the smell of the house changed. Gone was the cinnamon, gone the gentle scent of lavender I used to tuck into drawers. The air was filled with burnt popcorn, microwave meals, and something sharp I couldn't name. It was Sharon who brought up the idea of maybe finding a place that fits your needs better. She said it while scrolling on her phone. Said it like someone might say, "We're out of milk." I pretended not to hear, but I felt my spine stiffen. The next week, a pamphlet appeared on my nightstand. Peaceful Oaks, Senior Living with Dignity. The cover had an old couple playing cards, smiling too hard. I didn't touch it, just slid it into the bottom drawer under my winter socks. Mark never said anything. not directly. But I heard him, once, on the phone. She's not even paying rent, Sharon's carrying the food bills. We can't do this forever. I wanted to knock, to remind him I was still his mother, that I'd sold my mother's ring to help with his college fees, that I'd worked double shifts in that dusty library when Frank got sick, that I'd missed my own anniversary once to drive him back to campus when his car broke down. But I didn't. Because I knew he already knew. He just didn't care anymore. One night, I came downstairs for water. It was past midnight. The kitchen light was on, and Sharon was laughing. On FaceTime, maybe. I walked in slowly, trying not to startle her. She turned, startled anyway. "You scared me," she said sharply. "You're like a shadow." Like a shadow. That one stayed with me. I sat at the table, hands folded. She didn't offer me a drink, just went back to her phone. So I sat in silence. Let the faucet drip. Let the air hum low. Because there's a point when you stop asking to be seen. When you start realizing they don't want to see you. That your presence is more burden than blessing. They started locking the basement. Said it was dangerous, the stairs too steep. But my sewing machine was down there. My Christmas decorations, my memories. I asked for the key. Mark said he'd look into it. He never did. I started writing notes. In a little spiral notebook I kept under my pillow. Remember the blue teacup. Call Sister Mary. Ask about storage space at church. Check if Social Security deposit still goes to joint account. I wasn't planning anything, not yet. But I could feel something shift, not in them, in me, like the way leaves know when to loosen their grip, the way a bird feels the sky tug at its wings. There comes a day when waiting becomes wilting, and you just stop. Stop pretending it's okay. Stop making excuses for their coldness. Stop believing you owe them your silence. The photo was just the final thread. But the unraveling, that had begun long before. It was the day after Thanksgiving. The dishes were piled in the sink. Not porcelain, not my wedding china, just cheap paper plates sagging with grease. The turkey had come from a store, the kind in foil pans. Sharon said it was more efficient. Mark had nodded, mouth full, not meeting my eyes. I had risen early that morning, put on my soft gray sweater, the one with tiny pearl buttons, tied my apron the way I always did, front bow, towel tucked at the hip. Even made my cranberry compote, just like Frank used to love. Simmered it slow, with orange zest and a dash of clove. No one touched it. "Too tart," Sharon said, pushing it aside. The twins asked if there were fries. Mark scrolled through his phone the whole time. When I went to retrieve my pearl earrings, small things, nothing fancy, they were gone. I kept them in the little dish by the sink. Wore them only on holidays. I searched quietly, then asked gently. Sharon looked up from her tablet. "Maybe they fell. Or maybe you misplaced them, Mama. Happens." She called me Mama when she wanted to end the conversation. Later, I heard her tell the twins to stop leaving things on the counters. She's always moving stuff. The she was me. The doorbell rang around 3. A family friend, Ruth. She came with a box of cookies and a scarf she'd knitted for me, said she missed our old lunches. We stood by the porch, away from the noise. She looked toward the house, then back at me. "Are you all right?" I smiled. The kind of smile that cracks on the edges. "Of course," I said, but I wasn't. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I went into the kitchen. The house was still. Even the refrigerator hum seemed softer. I opened the drawer under the microwave, the one where Sharon kept mismatched lids and menus. My letters were there, the ones I'd written last winter. Birthday cards, church thank you notes, even a postcard from my sister in Ohio. Unopened, unnoticed, forgotten. I stood there a long time, holding one envelope in my hand, my handwriting, soft and rounded with age, and I felt it. The full weight of it, not just the loneliness that I'd come to know, had worn like an old coat, but the betrayal, the quiet dismissal, the theft of space, of voice. of belonging. I wasn't just being ignored, I was being unlived. They had taken my home, room by room, choice by choice, until all that was left of me was what I didn't say out loud. I sat on the edge of my bed that night, slippers touching cold wood, and looked around. My wedding photo was gone from the wall, replaced by some abstract painting. Neutral tones, Sharon had said. Good for resale value. Resale. That's when I remembered the letter, the one that came in the summer. I hadn't understood it fully. Legal talk, fine print. Mark said it was just a banking form, had me sign it while I was measuring flour. He joked about how no one reads the details anymore. I had trusted him, my own son. But something about that letter had tugged at me ever since. I remembered the paper, thicker than usual, embossed. That night, I opened the bottom drawer of my nightstand, pulled out my folder. Blue leather, scratched at the corners, filled with receipts and bills and documents from long ago. The letter was still there. And when I read it, slowly, carefully, my hands began to tremble. He had refinanced the house, used my name, my social security, my history. And somewhere in the tangle of legal lines, a clause, one that gave him partial control of my home. The one Frank and I had built, paid off, painted, prayed in. He had mortgaged memory, signed away what was sacred. I pressed my palm to my chest. I couldn't cry. The tears wouldn't come. What arrived instead was stillness, a kind of sharp calm I had never known before. Not anger, not yet, just truth. And truth is heavier than grief. That night, I didn't sleep. I just sat, a blanket over my knees, watching the curtains shift in the breeze. Somewhere, a wind chime sang, and in that soft ringing, I heard it. You do not belong here anymore. Not because I wasn't worthy, but because they had already decided I wasn't. There's something terrifying about being surrounded by family and feeling utterly alone. There's something cruel about silence when it replaces kindness. And there's something sacred, something holy, about realizing you will not be erased quietly. That was the night I began to remember who I was. Not a burden, not a background figure, not a faded photo on the wall. I was the one who built this story. And maybe it was time I started writing my own ending. The morning after, the house was quiet in that hollow sort of way, like when the last guest has left and the music has stopped and all that's left is the echo. I moved slowly, not because I was tired, though I was, but because I knew now that every step forward had to be different from the ones before, not just movement, meaning. I boiled water in the old kettle, not the electric one Sharon liked, pulled out a tea bag from the little wooden box Ruth had given me years ago, chamomile with a curl of lemon peel. I sipped it slowly, watching the steam rise in ribbons and let my mind unfurl with it. That letter, the legal one, it kept replaying in my head. I'd been so willing to trust, to sign, to step aside, to not be difficult. I told myself it was family. That love meant convenience. That sacrifice was the shape of motherhood. But now I saw the pattern. How my quiet had become their permission. How my absence from decisions wasn't grace. It was silence mistaken for consent. The shift began, not with a scream, but with a list. Just a pen and lined notebook. I wrote it sitting on the porch, bundled in a shawl, the sun filtering through bare branches. The twins were at school. Sharon was at work, Mark upstairs, tapping at his laptop. And I began. Gather all personal documents, find original deed, call Ruth, recheck Social Security deposits, look up local elder legal aid. No grand plan, just steps. Action is sometimes just remembering you can still move. I began with the small things. Slipped quietly into the basement one morning before sunrise. Sharon had left the door unlocked. I pulled out a dusty box marked Xmas and tucked inside it the framed photo of my wedding day. My sewing scissors. The blue teacup, found, cracked but not broken, tucked behind a bin like trash. Then came the closet. I began pulling together clothes I still felt myself in. Not what Sharon bought from the discount bin, but my old navy cardigan, my church skirt, my scarf with the little daisies on the edge. I hid things, not out of fear, but because I knew now I needed something of mine for wherever came next. And I started writing. Not letters, not diaries, just little memories, 1 page each, like, the first time Frank saw the house, he laughed, said the kitchen was too small, but he built me a spice rack by hand, said it would make up for it. I still smell nutmeg every winter because of that rack. Mark's first fever. I stayed up for 2 nights straight, reading the same bedtime story over and over until he slept. He used to call me his sunshine medicine. These weren't stories for anyone else. They were proof, to myself, that I had lived here, loved here, meant something here. They couldn't take that. One afternoon I called the church. Sister Mary answered. Her voice hadn't changed in 20 years. Soft but firm, like warm bread. I asked if she knew any legal folks who helped elders. Quiet ones. She paused, then said she'd have someone call me. And you take care of yourself, dear, she added. That dear landed like a blessing. Later that week, Ruth came by. She brought soup. Didn't ask questions. Just sat across from me at the porch table, knitting slowly, waiting. And when I was ready, I told her. Not everything. Just enough. She nodded. We'll figure it out, she said, and that we felt like a lifeline. Mark noticed I was quieter. Sharon said I seemed more forgetful. But it wasn't forgetfulness. It was focus. I didn't jump when someone needed the salt. I didn't offer to babysit the twins when Sharon sighed loudly. I didn't apologize when I made oatmeal too slow and the microwave was more efficient. I just smiled and went on. Because reclaiming begins not in confrontation, but in choosing what you will no longer carry. The guilt, the apology, the need to be liked for being silent. That Thanksgiving photo, the one I was told not to join, still sat on the fridge. Sharon had pinned it up with a magnet shaped like a pumpkin. Everyone was in it. Laughing. Posed in front of a golden wreath I had made 2 years ago. I looked at it long and slow one night. Then I took the magnet off, placed the photo inside a drawer, and put up something else in its place. A photo of my wedding day. Frank's arm around me, my smile wide, eyes full of that young hope we all start with. And beneath it, I taped a note. This was the day my story began, and I'm not done telling it. No one said anything, but I noticed the magnet stayed, and I knew something in the house had shifted, not for them, but for me. The first snowfall came early that year, soft, quiet flakes dusting the railing, the roof, the bare branches outside my window. I sat at the edge of the bed, hands wrapped around my tea, watching the world turn white. It felt like a kind of washing, not forgetfulness, but permission to begin again. I'd always loved the first snow. Frank used to say it was God's way of wiping the slate. I remember once, years ago, we stood outside in our coats, letting flakes melt on our eyelashes, and he whispered, "Clean start, Em." So I began. The folder came out first, the blue one with scuffed corners, where I kept everything that mattered. Not just papers, memories, proofs, birth certificate, marriage license, original house deed, utility bills in my name going back 30 years. Frank's handwritten note from when we paid off the mortgage. All ours now, Em. My Medicare information, my Social Security award letter, a savings account statement with my name on it alone. I stacked it all neatly, labeled it E. Thomas, personal and legal. And then I called Ruth. She arrived within the hour, still in her boots, cheeks pink from the cold. She hugged me without words, then followed me to the kitchen where I'd laid everything out. I need someone who knows how to read these things, I told her. Someone who can tell me what they took and what I still own. She nodded slowly. I know a woman, Linda. She works with seniors, helps when things get twisted. That word sat heavy. Twisted. But true. We called from my landline. Ruth stayed beside me, hand on mine as I spoke. Linda was gentle, calm, asked me to gather everything and bring it in, said she'd look it over, no charge. "This happens more than you think," she whispered. "But it doesn't have to end the same way." We scheduled a meeting for Thursday morning. I didn't tell Sharon or Mark. There was nothing to explain yet, nothing they needed to know. This wasn't about them anymore. This was about me. I spent the next 2 days quietly preparing. I wrote down every change I'd noticed since spring. My name missing from certain bills. The mail being redirected. Conversations about downsizing that never included me. A change in tone. The way they started calling it the house, not your house. That form Mark rushed me to sign. Each memory was a thread, and together they began to weave a picture. Thursday came with a gray sky and a brittle wind. Ruth picked me up early. We drove in silence, the heater humming between us. I held the folder close, like something fragile, something alive. Linda's office was small but warm, walls lined with books, a patchwork quilt over the back of a chair. She offered tea, peppermint, and I accepted. Then I handed her my folder. She spread the papers gently, like sacred things, and she read. For nearly an hour, she murmured, underlined, took notes. Occasionally glanced at me with something like sorrow in her eyes. When she finally looked up, she spoke slow, clear. "Emily, the house is still in your name. But..." That but stretched across the room. Mark added himself to the deed, not full ownership, but partial, and he took out a line of credit against the home. I nodded. I had expected that much. Linda continued. "Without your full understanding or consent, that's questionable, but not always illegal." Another pause. "The good news is, you're still the majority owner, and you still have rights, including the right to decide where you live and who lives with you." That word, right. I hadn't heard it in months. She handed me back the folder. "You're not powerless, Emily. You just need someone to stand with you." We talked through options. No drama, just facts. I could file a formal review of the deed. Could request the credit line be frozen until further investigation. Could even, if I chose, initiate proceedings to reclaim full title. Ruth drove me home after, hands tight on the wheel. "What do you want to do?" she asked gently. I looked out at the frost on the window pane. "I want to remember who I am, and then I want to act from there." That night, I didn't cry. I took out my old cedar box, the one Frank gave me on our 10th anniversary. Inside were my keepsakes, a dried flower from our wedding, a button from Mark's baby coat, a photo of my mother braiding my hair, and at the bottom, a letter, written in Frank's hand. "If you're reading this, Emmy, it means I'm gone. But listen, you are the root of this house, the center. Don't ever let anyone shake that, not even our own blood. Stand firm, love." I pressed it to my chest. They hadn't taken everything. And what remained, my name, my memories, my strength, was enough to begin again. It's strange, the way old pain lives in the body. Quiet, folded into corners, like letters you never mailed but couldn't bring yourself to burn. After meeting with Linda, after holding Frank's letter against my chest that night, I found myself drifting. Not asleep, not quite awake. Just floating somewhere between now and then. And from that place, a memory surfaced. A wound I had tucked deep inside. One I thought I'd made peace with. But there it was, as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. I was 27. We had just lost our second baby, a girl, stillborn, 7.5 months along. Her name would have been Nora. I had sewn a little yellow blanket for her. It sat folded in the bottom drawer, untouched. Frank had cried with me that first night, sitting on the edge of the bed, holding my hand. But by the third morning, he was already back in the field saying, "Work doesn't wait." I didn't blame him, not then. But his quiet became a silence I couldn't reach through. One Sunday, I remember sitting at church beside him, my hands trembling, eyes raw from sleeplessness, and after service, the pastor's wife leaned in and said, "At least you have Mark. That's more than some get." It wasn't meant cruelly, but it landed like a stone. I remember walking home ahead of Frank, that yellow blanket folded in my purse like a secret. When we got back, I placed it in the cedar box, same one I'd later keep his letter in, and I wept, alone. No funeral, no photos, no headstone, just quiet ache. Frank never asked about the blanket, not once. We never spoke of her again. That kind of pain doesn't leave, it just changes shape. It becomes a lens through which you see other betrayals, other silences. I think, if I'm honest, that's when I learned how to shrink myself, to not take up space with my grief, to be grateful for what I had, even if what I had was barely holding together. And I carried that lesson into everything, into raising Mark, into being the dependable daughter-in-law, into those long years of PTA meetings and casserole deliveries and sitting in waiting rooms while everyone else made the decisions. I thought love meant disappearing gracefully. It's why, when Sharon began taking over little things, the mail, the shopping, the calendar, I didn't object. I thought, this is what happens. Mothers fade, daughters rise. But that memory of Nora, that quiet, unmarked grief, reminded me, fading is not the same as being erased. I remembered how I used to sit in Nora's nursery before it was emptied, just me and the rocking chair, humming lullabies into a room with no child. That loss taught me something I didn't understand fully until now. That love is not supposed to silence you. That family should not demand your invisibility in exchange for belonging. There was another memory, too. A smaller one, but sharp. Mark was 10. He'd come home from school, face streaked with tears, said the other boys made fun of his lunch. "It smells like old lady food," they'd said. He'd thrown it away and gone hungry. That night, I asked if he wanted me to pack something different. He just nodded, so I stopped packing his lunch. Sharon took over when she married in. Packaged snacks, sandwiches with the crust cut off, juice boxes and plastic wrappers. I never packed another one again. And it wasn't about the lunch. It was about the way I began stepping back from even the smallest roles, believing I was only worthy if I was invisible. It didn't happen all at once. It was years of little steps backward, of letting others decide, of convincing myself that dignity meant quietness, even when it turned into disappearance. But now I could see the thread. From that little yellow blanket, to the untouched lunchbox, to the Thanksgiving photo I wasn't in. It was all the same story. And it wasn't just about what they had done, it was about what I had allowed, hoping they would see me anyway. But they didn't. So now, I had to see myself. That night, I lit a candle, set the cedar box on the table. I took out Nora's blanket, held it in my hands after all these years. It still smelled faintly of lavender and cotton. I whispered her name, for the first time in decades. Then I refolded the blanket gently and added a note inside. You were here, and you mattered. It felt like breathing again after a long time underwater, and in that breath, I realized, this journey I was on, it wasn't just about deeds and documents. It was about reclaiming every piece of me they'd overlooked, every quiet loss I never gave language to. I wasn't just fighting for a house. I was finding my way back to the woman who once believed she could rock her daughter to sleep in a room filled with lullabies. And even if that room was gone, I could still sing. The letter came on a Tuesday. I remember because it was laundry day, the scent of soap still hanging on the warm towels piled on my bed, sunlight pouring in from the west window. It was tucked into the stack of mail Sharon had left on the hallway table. A white envelope with a glossy return address. Thurman and Slate, attorneys at law. I opened it, curious at first, assuming maybe it was a Medicare notice or something to do with taxes. But it wasn't. It was a notice of transfer, not a suggestion, not a proposal. A final confirmation. According to the document, the house had been legally placed under joint ownership between myself and Mark and a newly formed family trust. A trust I had never heard of. One that listed Sharon and Mark as trustees, and one that, upon my passing, would make them sole owners, regardless of any other will or personal intention. The paper slipped from my fingers and floated to the floor like a broken leaf. I stood there, staring at it. Not angry, just hollow. They had already done it. Not planning to, not thinking about it. Done. All those conversations about just sign this, Mom, and we're protecting your interests, and it's simpler this way, they weren't about protection. They were about quiet removal. I picked the letter up with both hands and sat down. I read every word, slowly, twice. It was all written in clean, polite legal language. Words like estate simplification and probate avoidance and long-term asset planning. But it all meant one thing, that my home, the house I cleaned, cooked in, cried in, raised Mark in, was no longer truly mine. Not fully. It was papered over, absorbed, like a tree overtaken by ivy until its own bark can't breathe. And worst of all, they hadn't told me. They hadn't even had the decency to lie. Just silence. Just signatures in the dark. I walked into the kitchen, turned off the kettle I had forgotten I'd set to boil. My hands were shaking, not with rage, but with something quieter, something colder. The realization that they never thought I'd read it, that they counted on me being too tired, too trusting, too old. I placed the letter in the folder Linda had asked me to keep updated. Then I sat at the kitchen table, staring out at the garden. The bird feeder still swayed gently in the wind, half filled. A lone cardinal hopped beneath it, pecking at the ground. Life, as always, carried on, even as something inside me collapsed. Later that evening, Sharon came over with leftovers, a plastic container of lasagna, the lid steamed. She talked as she always did, half distracted, tapping her phone. "I'll be gone this weekend, by the way," she said. "So Mark will bring your pills Saturday. Don't forget, we've got the accountant meeting next week." I nodded. My voice couldn't find its way out. She didn't notice. Before she left, she placed the lasagna in the fridge, kissed the air near my cheek, and walked out humming. I sat back down and cried, not loudly, not with sobs, just tears sliding silently, falling into the folds of my hands. It wasn't just the house, it was the decision, made without me, for after me, as if I was already gone, as if my name, my voice, my presence no longer mattered. I wasn't even part of the planning, just the paperwork, a line item, a contingency. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, every breath stiff with remembering how many nights I sat beside Mark's bed, spoon-feeding him ginger tea when he was sick, how I stayed up sewing his Halloween costumes, the cowboy, the pirate, the astronaut, how I pawned my grandmother's brooch to help pay his college deposit when Frank was out of work. And now, I was an afterthought, even in the place I built with my hands. At some point near dawn, I rose from bed, walked barefoot to the living room where moonlight spilled through the curtains. I lit the candle again, the one by the cedar box. I didn't speak aloud, but inside I whispered one word. Enough. Not the angry kind, the steady kind, the kind that follows realization. I was not gone, I was still here, and if they wouldn't honor that, I would. The next morning I called Linda again. I told her about the letter. She didn't sound surprised, but she did sound resolute. "Bring it in," she said. "We still have options. They can't remove you from your own life unless you agree to disappear, and you haven't." That word, haven't, landed like an anchor. I hadn't disappeared. I had been patient, kind, trusting, but never absent. And now I wouldn't be silent. I didn't confront them. Not Mark, not Sharon. There was no scene, no slamming of doors, no bitter declarations. I simply stopped asking when they'd visit, stopped waiting to be invited to dinners or appointments, Stopped pretending I didn't see what had been quietly taken. It wasn't retreat, not this time. It was something quieter, something sturdier. A shift, like the way a tide turns before you notice. Subtle, but certain. The morning after I spoke with Linda, I made myself oatmeal the old way, with milk on the stovetop and a pinch of cinnamon. No instant packets, no rushing. I sat by the window with my bowl, wrapped in my old cardigan, the one with the elbow patches I'd sewn on 20 years ago. The sun touched the far fence. A bluebird landed on the railing. I didn't reach for my phone. I didn't scroll or check the time. I just breathed. That week, I began tending the garden again, not for yield, but for joy. Pulled up weeds with my hands, planted lavender along the walkway, dug out the old kneeling bench from the garage, dusted it off, and let the earth speak to my fingers. No one noticed, and that was fine, because this shift wasn't for them, it was for me. I went to the bank one afternoon and sat with a young teller named Jaime. I updated my information, placed alerts on my accounts, and asked for a printed ledger. He smiled politely, but I could tell he didn't expect someone my age to be so clear. I smiled right back. Let them underestimate me. At the library, I pulled out old gardening books, took home 3 novels I'd always meant to read, signed up for a Tuesday memoir class for seniors. The woman at the desk said I was the first to enroll this season. It might get canceled, she warned. That's all right, I said. I'm showing up anyway. That's what this shift was, showing up for myself. One afternoon, I took down the family photos in the hallway. Not out of anger, but because I wanted to choose which memories I lived alongside. I kept the one of me holding Mark at 3 months, his fist wrapped around my finger. I kept the one from our road trip to Wyoming, where Frank had taken a candid shot of me looking out across the plains. But I put away the staged portraits, the forced smiles, the photos where I stood off to the side, cropped half out. And in their place, I hung watercolors, soft paintings of barns, lavender fields, and one of a rocking chair beneath a window. Things that felt like me. Things that reminded me I still existed outside their frame. I didn't tell anyone. No announcements, no justifications. This was a shift they'd only notice when they wondered what had changed and realized they hadn't been invited to the noticing. On a Thursday morning, Sharon called. She asked if I'd remind her of the tax ID for the trust. I told her I didn't have it on hand, which was true, because I had passed everything over to Linda. There was a pause on the line, then a clipped, "Okay, I'll check the binder." I didn't fill the silence. She hung up first. I made myself tea and sat on the porch, letting the breeze lift the hem of my skirt. And for the first time in a long while, I wasn't waiting for anyone to pull into the driveway. I had stopped performing, stopped trying to prove my usefulness, my memory, my good attitude. I let myself be slow, soft, full of quiet knowing. Even at the pharmacy, when the young woman asked if I was still on "those meds your daughter ordered," I corrected her, gently. "She's my daughter-in-law, and I'll manage the order myself now, thank you." She blinked, nodded. It felt small, but it was mine. I wore lipstick to the grocery store that Saturday, not for anyone else, just because the shade reminded me of how I used to feel walking beside Frank at the state fair when I was young and unburdened. I made meatloaf the way my mother used to, real breadcrumbs, not crackers, and ate it by candlelight, linen napkin folded on my lap. Not because it was a holiday, but because I deserved ceremony, even alone. The shift didn't come all at once, but day by day, I felt something I hadn't in years. Space, to breathe, to decide, to reclaim. They hadn't noticed yet. Mark still sent short texts. "You okay?" that I responded to with, "I'm well, thank you." Sharon didn't ask about the house. Maybe they thought the silence meant compliance, but I knew better now. My silence was no longer surrender, it was sanctuary. I was creating a world they didn't get to design, a life outside their schedule, their spreadsheets, their careful inheritance plans. And in that life, I was whole. I still kept Frank's letter near, still held it now and then, not as a tether to grief, but as proof that once someone saw me clearly enough to leave me the home I had built, with my hands, my heart, and my history, and that even now, when they tried to write me out, I could write myself back in. Linda called on a Wednesday. I was just coming in from the garden, hands muddy, knees aching in the best sort of way. She asked if I could stop by the office. Not urgent, she said, but important. So I did. Wore my good sweater, the burgundy one with the pearl buttons. Brought a copy of the letter, Frank's original deed, and the envelope marked Sharon's Trust that I'd never touched again. Her office was cooler than usual. A quiet hum from the ceiling fan, the scent of lemon oil on wood. Linda had cleared her desk except for a single manila folder. She offered tea, but I shook my head. "I think we're ready," she said, tapping the folder. I sat down slowly, the leather of the chair creaking beneath me. "There's more in your corner than you think," she began, lifting the folder open. "You're still the legal co-owner of the home. Any trust arrangement that affects your stake requires your signature, and you never gave that." I didn't speak. "Not yet," she continued, laying out the paper trail. "What they filed, it's shaky. They used ambiguity, but not accuracy. You still have rights, and frankly, the court would see this transfer as coercive if challenged." I looked at the folder, all the neat papers, the codes, the dates, and I felt something unusual. Relief, but stronger than that. A rootedness. I was still here, still planted in the soil of my own name. Then Linda said something I hadn't expected. "You don't have to go to court to reclaim this. We can revise the deed. Quietly, reinstate your sole ownership while you're alive. They'll learn only if they try to act on it." She paused. "But that choice is yours." She slid a pen across the desk. Black ink, smooth, heavy, and for a moment I saw my hand hovering above the page, the same hand that had once filled out field trip forms, signed rent checks, changed emergency contacts. Hands that had built a life, not with big gestures, but with quiet, daily faith. I picked up the pen and signed. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about punishing Mark or Sharon. It was about returning to a truth that had always been mine, to dignity, held not in a deed, but in knowing I had the right to say, "This is still my home." Linda sealed the folder. "I'll take care of the filing. You won't need to see them unless you want to." I nodded. I left her office lighter, but more anchored than I'd felt in years. It was a strange thing, the power of one signature. It wasn't the pen stroke. It was the reclaiming. Later that week, I received a small envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside, a birthday card from my granddaughter, Allison. It was hand-drawn, pink flowers, a little bench, a heart beside the words, "To Grandma, who smells like lavender." She'd written in big looping letters, "I miss your hugs. Mom says you're busy, but I hope we can do cookies again soon." I held that card against my chest and wept. Allison hadn't forgotten. She still remembered the scent of my baking, the way I pressed kisses into her hair as we watched birds through the window. And even now, in the middle of all this, there was still someone small, someone sweet, who hadn't pushed me into the background. A flicker of connection, an ally, maybe not with power or papers, but with presence. I sent her a note back, not through Sharon, but directly. I mailed it with a photo of us from that snowy December, where she wore my red scarf and grinned with cookie crumbs on her chin. "My door is always open," I wrote, "whenever your heart wants to come through it." I didn't know if Sharon would intercept it, but I hoped, just hoped, that the little girl inside her house still carried a trace of the warmth I gave her. At night now, I lit a single lamp and opened one of the novels I'd borrowed from the library. The silence of the house didn't feel hollow anymore. It felt mine. Sometimes I'd find myself humming, not for anyone, just because the day had carried me gently. I wasn't angry. I was awake. And in that stillness, I discovered something I hadn't in decades. The quiet was never emptiness. It was sovereignty. It was the sound of my own breath, no longer fighting to be heard above theirs. It was the strength that came not from protest, but from presence. I moved through each day not with a plan, but with awareness of what I would and would not allow, of who I would and would not invite. The shift had deepened, and now it had roots. It was subtle at first. A missed call from Mark, no voicemail, then another, 2 rings, then silence. I didn't call back. 2 days later, Sharon showed up in my driveway, unannounced. I was watering the lavender when I saw her car, sleek and silver, roll in like a cloud that didn't belong to this sky. She stepped out, face tight, sunglasses hiding whatever might have flickered in her eyes. She called out, "Margaret," like she was reading my name off a list. I didn't move toward her. I simply stood, hose in hand, letting the stream fall across the roots. "I got a notice," she said, stepping closer. "From the registrar's office. About the deed." Still, I didn't speak, just nodded once, calm. "I thought we'd agreed on everything," she continued, a trace of practiced composure in her voice. I turned off the hose, coiled it gently, then met her eyes. "We didn't," I said. "You and Mark agreed. I was bypassed." Sharon blinked. I could see it, the weight of being seen. No fury, no noise, just truth, calmly offered. And truth, I've learned, is heavier than rage. "I was only trying to protect Mark's time," she added quickly. "You know how stretched he is." I almost smiled, because even now, she couldn't say it, couldn't name what they did, couldn't admit they'd tried to cut me out, quietly, like trimming fat from a recipe. But I didn't argue. I simply said, "You'll need to update your plans. The house is mine." She stood still, no shouting, no tears, just silence between 2 women, one who had learned the taste of entitlement and one who had rediscovered her voice. After a moment, Sharon said, "He won't take this well." I nodded. "I imagine not." And I turned, walked back toward the porch, slow and steady, the wood of the steps warm beneath my feet. She didn't follow. She left without another word. That night, Mark called. I didn't answer. The next morning, he texted, "Mom, can we talk?" I stared at the screen, then placed it face down on the table. Because now, I knew. Just because they finally noticed didn't mean I had to open the door again. They would feel the loss. The space where my silence used to be complicit. The weight of my absence in their tidy plans. I heard later, from a neighbor, that they had to meet with a new lawyer. Something about inheritance needing to be revised. Apparently, Sharon had been livid, not because I hurt them, but because I no longer agreed to be useful on their terms. And when usefulness is gone, some people unravel. But I didn't. I got up every morning, fed the birds, walked down the street to the coffee shop, waved at the mailman. No headlines, no scenes. Just steady, rooted living. Linda sent me a final packet by mail, confirmation of the revised deed, notarized and filed. At the bottom of the stack was a note. "You've reminded me what quiet strength looks like." I held it in my lap for a while, because I hadn't set out to remind anyone. I'd simply returned to myself, and somehow, that was enough. One Sunday, Allison showed up, unannounced, like her mother. But her knock was softer. She held a paper bag from the bakery, 2 scones and a tiny jam jar. "Dad dropped me at a friend's," she said, "but I asked them to leave me here." I let her in. We sat on the porch and split a scone, the wind lifting strands of her hair. She didn't ask questions. She just rested her head on my shoulder and whispered, "I missed you." And I, this time, didn't cry. Because her being here wasn't a wound reopening. It was a thread being tied, a stitch in the right place. She came the next few weekends, one at a time. We made cookies, painted small flower pots, read chapters of the book she loved. She didn't bring news from her house, and I didn't ask. We created our own weather, and in that small world, I felt something bloom, A consequence of their choices, yes, but also a consequence of mine. Because when you stop making yourself available to the ones who misuse your kindness, you create space for something real, something rooted. The phone still rang. Texts still came, sometimes long, sometimes curt. But I didn't answer them all, not out of cruelty, but clarity. They had seen me as a fixture. Now they would feel my absence as a mirror. Let them sit with it. Let them decide who they are without my silence to lean on. And if they ever returned, not out of convenience, but care, I'd meet them there. But I wouldn't wait. Because I was no longer in the background. I was here, living, still, quietly whole. It was late November when the call came. Sharon again. This time her voice was different. Not clipped, not cold, just tired. "We'd like to come over," she said. "All of us, for Thanksgiving." I paused, my hand resting on the rim of the sink. The water in the kettle behind me had just started to hum. "I'm not hosting this year," I said softly. There was a silence, a long one. "Oh," she replied. That "oh" carried more weight than anything she could have shouted. It was a sound I hadn't heard from her in years. Recognition. "I'll be staying here," I added, "but I've made other plans. Quiet ones." She asked if they could come by anyway. I told her, if it's to drop off a pie, sure, but I won't be setting the table. She said, "Okay." Hung up with a strange slowness, like her fingers weren't sure how to end the call. On Thanksgiving morning, I woke early. The wind was gentle, and the sky wore that soft gray that only November carries. Neither sad nor bright, just honest. I set the kettle on, buttered 2 slices of bread, and placed a small bouquet on the kitchen table. Sprigs of pine, rosemary, and 1 white chrysanthemum. A symbol, maybe, of what doesn't wilt under pressure. By noon, the house was still and warm. No clatter of feet, no smells of turkey or cranberry, no voices asking where the gravy boat was. Just peace. At 1 hour, a knock. Not loud, just enough to stir the quiet. I opened the door to find Mark and Sharon standing side by side. Allison behind them, holding something in a foil-covered dish. No other grandchildren, no fanfare. They stepped in. I didn't invite them to sit, didn't offer coffee or tea. They stood in the entry, as if waiting for instruction. Sharon started. "We talked about the trust, about what we did." Mark looked down. I let the silence stay, let it stretch. Because this time, I wasn't going to save them from it. "I think we got ahead of ourselves," she continued. "We should have asked you, involved you. We were thinking about the future, but—" "You weren't thinking about me," I said quietly. It wasn't a question. She nodded. Mark swallowed hard. His voice, when it came, was hoarse. "I thought you'd be okay with it, that you'd understand." "I always understood," I said. What I didn't do was agree. They didn't argue, they didn't defend. And for once, I didn't explain my pain. I let them carry it. Then I said the words I had waited months to say. "I'm not angry anymore, but I've changed what I'll allow." Sharon looked up, her eyes glassy. "I've updated the deed," I added. "The house is mine again, until I choose otherwise, if I choose otherwise." They both nodded. No resistance, no debate, just quiet reception. "I'll always love you," I said, "but I won't be overlooked again." I turned to Allison, still holding the dish. She smiled shyly and stepped forward. "Sweet potato casserole," she said. I made the marshmallows into little hearts. I reached for it and held her gaze. "That was thoughtful," I whispered. She smiled. Her light hadn't dimmed. Not yet. They left soon after. No hugs, just a small goodbye. They stepped into the cold and drove away. I closed the door behind them, and for the first time felt no ache, only breath, only room, only quiet. I sat down at the table and uncovered the dish. It was warm, soft. And those marshmallow hearts? They stayed intact, even through the heat, even through the change. I picked up my fork and took a bite. Sweet, simple, and entirely enough. The days that followed were unremarkable, and that was the grace of it. There were no grand gestures, no sudden reunions over pies and apologies, just mornings, soft light on the windowsill, the hum of the refrigerator, and a strange new ease in my shoulders. I wasn't waiting anymore, not for acknowledgement, not for explanations. I had reclaimed my rhythm. Simple things began to carry more weight. My morning walk, where the neighbor's dog always barked at the same bird. My afternoon tea, steeped in the same chipped cup I once hid from Sharon's frowns. Evenings, when the light curled against the walls just right, and I could sit without planning dinner for 10. One quiet Tuesday, I opened the old hall closet, the one they once emptied of its clutter. I had forgotten what I'd saved. There, behind the photo boxes, was a folded quilt. Faded, handmade, stitched by my mother's hands when I first married James. It smelled of cedar and old hopes. I pulled it out and laid it across the foot of my bed. A quiet kind of crown. And as I smoothed its corners, I thought, this is what they forget. That the ones who came before carried the weight, held it in their fingers, in their stitches, in their bones. And even if the next ones try to erase or rearrange, those threads remain. One morning, I received a card in the mail. From Linda. Inside, a short note. You taught me how to honor myself. Thank you. I placed it next to my recipe book, between a picture of Allison in second grade and a note James once scribbled on a napkin. Small artifacts of love. Real love. Not the kind that demands silence in return for approval, but the kind that lingers, even after the door is gently closed. By early December, I had decided on something. A gift for myself. I called the local community center, asked about classes. They had a watercolor group meeting Mondays and Fridays. So the next week, I went. Walked in with my little tin set and a blank pad. No one asked my story. No one asked who I belonged to. We just painted. And for the first time in years, I felt unnamed. Not mom, not grandma, not dependent. Just me. The woman with gray hair and soft hands who liked to paint forget-me-nots and the edges of teacups. I painted the quilt once, the folds, the stitching, how it seemed to glow in its own quiet way. One of the women, Ruth, said, "That looks like peace." I nodded, because it was. Allison came again before Christmas, this time with a scarf she knitted herself. "I picked the yarn," she said proudly. "It reminded me of your old sweater." I draped it around my shoulders and held her hand. We sat on the couch, the fire flickering low. She didn't ask questions, didn't bring messages from home, just her presence. And in that, I found a gentle promise. A future not shaped by correction, but connection. That night, after she left, I wrote something down, folded it carefully, placed it in the envelope I'd tucked into my side drawer. The new will. The one only I had access to. I had changed it, not to punish, but to protect, to ensure that what I'd built and rebuilt would never again be used to silence me. The envelope was labeled with one word, dignity. That was what I had found, not in speeches, not in fights, but in steady refusal to be erased. I did not tear apart the family. I simply walked away from the corner they put me in. And when they looked up, I was no longer there. Only the space remained. Quiet, unapologetic, and mine. Now, as I sit here, the last light of day folding itself gently across my table, I can hear the clock ticking again, not loud, just steady, and that's how I live now, steady. I still make tea at 4, still water my violets every Thursday, still hum the same hymn when I sweep the porch. But something is different now, not in the world, but in me. I no longer wait for the phone to ring with their voices. I no longer wonder if I'll be invited, included, remembered. Because I remember myself. I am not what they forgot to carry. I am what refused to be dropped. I walk slower these days, but I walk with both feet planted in truth. There's a photo frame by my bed now. not the one from last Thanksgiving. That one is gone. Replaced with a simple black and white picture of me at 21, standing barefoot in a summer field. It reminds me who I was before titles, before roles, before they asked me to shrink for their comfort. Now, when I speak, it is not to be accepted. It is simply to be heard. And when I rest, it is not out of defeat. It is peace. Not because they came back different, but because I came back to myself. And that is the quietest kind of victory there is. If you've ever felt forgotten or unseen, you're not alone. Your voice matters, even in silence. Your worth is not measured by who stays, but by how gently you hold your own heart when they leave. Share your story in the comments, because somewhere, someone needs to know. They aren't alone either.